Good evening. Welcome. I'm Tina Olson. I'm the director of the University of Michigan Museum of Art, and I'm also co-chair of the University of Michigan's Arts Initiative. And I am here to kick off our program tonight entitled, Is the Future of Art the Death of Art? This is the debut of a new program for us that's called The Future of Art, and it's sponsored by the University of Michigan's Presidential Arts Initiative. So I wanted to kind of begin us tonight by saying a little bit about that initiative and the broader Future of Art program, and then I'll turn the floor over to our host, Rebecca Modrak. So the Arts Initiative is at the beginning of a 2-year startup phase, and it has big, ambitious goals. What we want to do is to design and craft a large-scale arts initiative that will bring focus, energy, funding, and attention to the arts at the University of Michigan. We want to make the arts a fundamental part of a University of Michigan education. We want to think broadly and deeply about the role and capacity of the arts at a large-scale public university like the U of M. And we want to think about the specific histories of arts here across schools and units and time, and how those might be leveraged and capitalized on, perhaps even in some cases integrated. And of course, we want to make evident how the arts bear on the articulation, the visibility, and the solving of the most complex and pressing problems of our time. So to that end, we are focused on a few different things, and I just wanted to say a few words about them. We've just announced the results of a first phase of pilot grants. We had more than 80 applications from across the campuses here at the U of M. 8 grants were awarded for really interesting and ambitious projects. And we are kicking those off shortly. We're also about to launch 2 student series. One will kick off at the Diversity Summit on October 26th and is a student design challenge related to DE&I efforts, and the other is a student performance live stream series. You can find out more about those on our website and stay informed of announcements about them, and the website is in the chat, I believe. So the program, The Future of Art, Rebecca Modrak was the impetus for the program. She came to me and Jonathan Massey, the initiative's other co-chair, with a specific idea for tonight's program. But it immediately occurred to all of us that the university and the world could really use a program that asked big, thorny questions about where the arts writ large were going, what was facing them, the threats they were grappling with, how they were absorbing, addressing, and refracting the pandemic, our re-energized civil rights movement and all of its dimensions, climate change, and more. The future part of the program also recognizes and capitalizes on the unique capacity of the arts to envision and produce new futures, to help us picture them, and to help us invent the forms, paradigms, media, and the language to express those futures, and even provide the tools to produce them. So our program, Future of Art, is not another series of artist talks, but a view from different viewpoints, lenses at the themes, topics of the arts as they are intertwined with the future. Going forward, we're thinking about programs on monuments, on indigenous arts and utopias, on future cities in a pandemic era, on who gets to be an artist and who doesn't. If you'd like to suggest a topic, we're very open to ideas. And if you want to stay abreast of future of art, future programs, again, sign up at our website. Thank you again for coming tonight. I'd like to now introduce Rebecca Modrak, professor at the Stamp School of Art and Design and partner collaborator impetus of the Future of Art series, who will say more about tonight's program and our panelists.
Thank you, Tina. A very big thank you to you and to Dean Massey for investing in conversations about the future of art. And I'd also like to thank Allison Rivet for supporting all the planning needed to bring us all together this afternoon. I'm going to try to take us as quickly as possible to our guest speakers. For the best viewing experience, please change your settings to speaker view. That's the icon with the single figure in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. During the presentations, all attendee microphones will be muted, but the chat is open. Please feel free to write questions in the chat as they come to mind during the presentation, and I'll raise as many as possible during the Q&A. Our four speakers this afternoon will each have 10 minutes to tell us about the status of art making and their ideas for the future of art, and then we'll head into Q&A. Our first speaker today, Bill Deresiewicz, is an award-winning essayist and critic and a former professor of English at Yale. He is the recipient of a National Book Critics Circle Award for Excellence in Reviewing and is the New York Times bestselling author of Excellent Sheep, A Jane Austen Education, and most recently, the book that compelled this event, The Death of the Artist, How Creators Are Struggling to Survive in the Age of Billionaires and Big Tech. Literati Bookstore is the preferred bookseller of today's event, and the link to Literati is now in the chat. Each of the three artists with us this afternoon is featured in The Death of the Artist. Inongo Lumumba Kasongo is a rap artist known as SAMMUS. Asked about art and money in the book, she describes the gradual process of valuing her art by becoming comfortable putting a dollar amount on her work. Inongo describes herself as a Black feminist rap artist and producer from Ithaca, New York. She has a PhD in Science and Technology Studies from Cornell University and is currently a postdoctoral fellow at Brown University in the music department, teaching classes on rap songwriting and feminist sound studies. Atiya Jones is another artist who stood out in The Death of the Artist because of her choices and commentary on education, and because of her decision to move from her hometown of Brooklyn to Pittsburgh, where, in her words, everyone's pulling each other up the ladder. Atiya is a multidisciplinary artist and creative director at 1220 Studio. Her work is about human connection and serves as a visual depiction of healing, finding one's tribe and building a life as a unit, the magic permeating beneath the surface of self, and the search to find it. Our fourth panelist, Monica Byrne, is a playwright and science fiction novelist based in Durham, North Carolina. In The Death of the Artist, she describes an exercise that I think all creators should start to adopt. She tracks her professional efforts in what she calls an anti-resume, a spreadsheet of submissions, applications, and queries. In 6 years, she entered 18 acceptances and 548 rejections, which sounds about right if you're working really hard. Monica's work is funded by a community of patrons on Patreon. Her first novel, The Girl in the Road, was published in 2014 and won the James Tiptree Jr. Award. Her second novel, The Actual Star, will be published in Harper Voyager in 2021. Please join me in welcoming all of our speakers, and I invite Bill to the Zoom stage.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for being here to watch and listen. Thanks to Rebecca for conceiving of this and putting it together, and everyone who helped put it together, and the artists who are joining me. I'm going to give sort of the big picture, at least as I see the big picture, that I hope will contextualize what the artists have to say today. We tend to believe that art has always been the same thing. Not that art hasn't evolved, obviously it has, but that we've always understood it in the same way, and that artists have always played the same role throughout history. So we say things like, artists have always spoken truth to power, or art has always played a special role in society. These statements are not true. Those ideas and others like them date only to the last 200 or 300 years. Before that, in the Renaissance, but before the Renaissance and earlier, artists were considered artisans. The two words, not coincidentally, sound very similar, and in fact they were the same word. Artists, like other artisans, served apprenticeships, worked to contract, and did what they were paid or supported to do. They did not question official beliefs or challenge existing structures of authority. And this was even true of the most celebrated figures like Michelangelo, Shakespeare, Bach. I call this, in the book, I call this the first paradigm, the artist as artisan. It was only starting in the 18th century with the advent of what we call modernity, and in conjunction with a lot of other phenomena like democracy and the idea of the citizen and the idea of rights and the Enlightenment and many other things, that the notion of art emerged. In other words, art with a capital A, and with it a new notion of the artist. Now by art with a capital A, I mean the idea that art constitutes an autonomous realm of expression, not subordinate to religious or secular authorities, and that the role of the artist is to articulate new and uncomfortable truths. The ideas that I think we still hold today. Art came to be seen as a kind of secular religion, especially with the decline of the authority and credibility of traditional religions, of traditional Christianity in particular in the West. Art came to be seen as a kind of secular religion, the place where people went to contemplate moral and spiritual questions. And I would venture to say that for a lot of people listening today, that is how they understand art. That is how the role that art plays in their lives. The place that they go to contemplate moral and spiritual questions, the place they go, in other words, for meaning. Now, when we talk about the role of economics here, we have to realize that these ideas arose with capitalism. Both arose with capitalism and against it. I should say that all of the paradigms that I'm laying out, and this is now the second paradigm, are undergirded by an economic substrate. They are all created, structured by the way that artists get paid or supported. So in this second paradigm, the artist's new independence was made possible by the market, because the market enabled artists to profit directly from their work and thus freed them from patronage and the obedience that it entailed. But the new self-image of the artist as a kind of secular prophet also involved a principled refusal of the market, a desire to avoid its compromising entanglements. And again, this is still central to the way we understand art. Art should be kept separate from money. Artists, if you think about money, you're a sellout, all that stuff. Now, the solution to this contradiction, or the response to this contradiction, was the figure of the bohemian, which is a word that emerged in the 19th century. A bohemian is someone who lives an unconventional and creative life on the social and economic margins. Someone, in other words, who lives cheaply and stays as far away from the market as they can manage. This is what I call the second paradigm, the artist as bohemian. And it predominated up until the middle, roughly up until the middle of the 20th century, all the way through the great ages of Romanticism and modernism and everything in between. After World War II, the paradigm changed again. That was the age of what was known at the time as the culture boom. We built museums, theaters, concert halls, founded orchestras, opera companies, ballet troupes, all in unprecedented numbers. And on the for-profit side, the music publishing and film and television industries exploded in size, as did the world of visual art, the world of galleries and also museums. In other words, art became institutionalized and the artist became a product and denizen of institutions, in other words, a professional. Someone with middle-class status, a middle-class standard of living, and a professional career path that ran through universities and other institutions. So, for example, the MFA degree was not invented until the 1920s. And as of 1940, there were only 11 institutions awarding MFAs, 11. By 1980, there were 147. And now it's probably several hundred. It is several hundred. This is the third paradigm, the artist as professional. Economically, to be a professional is to be shielded from the market by the institutions with which you are affiliated. So, for example, if you're a professor, the university worries about tuition and donors and all that stuff. On the for-profit side, it's the label or the publisher or the gallery that worries about profit and loss, about marketing and distribution. But now, as I document in the book, and this is mostly what the book is about, a new paradigm is emerging. And that's because, starting in the late 1990s, the internet came along and did a couple of huge things, actually several, more than a couple of huge things, but a couple in particular, to the arts. First, it undermined the business model of the institutions, especially the for-profit ones. Most obviously, Napster cut the music business in half almost overnight. Amazon ate into publishers' profits. First Craigslist, then Google and Facebook all but destroyed journalism, meaning newspapers and magazines, which are a big source of income for writers in the form of freelance writing. Hollywood was hit by streaming and piracy. And meanwhile, universities were tightening their belts under market pressure, among other things, by turning their classrooms over to adjuncts, devastating academic teaching as a source of financial support. But the internet also did another huge thing. It enabled artists to circumvent the institutions, to circumvent the culture industry, the gatekeepers, the suits, the labels, the publishers, the studios, the galleries, and appealed directly to the audience. So you can post your visual art on Instagram. You can put your music up on Spotify or YouTube. You can self-publish your novel on any one of more than a dozen platforms. In other words, to use the terms of art that have emerged for this, you can aggregate an audience and you can monetize your audience. And it should be said that one of the most important ways that you can monetize your audience is through another new internet-enabled phenomenon, crowdfunding, meaning especially Kickstarter and Patreon. But note that both of these developments, the decline of institutions and the ability to circumvent them, means that artists are now immersed in the market as never before, immersed without mediation. You can't stand aside from the market like a bohemian because you're effectively running your own one-person business, complete with production, management, and marketing departments, and you can't take refuge in the shield of institutions. And this is what I call the fourth paradigm. I don't have time to go into all of its characteristics as I try to tease them out in the book and the many ways that I think they're affecting art. I'll only say that what's at stake ultimately, and this relates to the title of today's panel, is precisely whether art, if it has to serve its masters in the market, can retain its independence as an autonomous realm of expression, a way to tell new truths. Meanwhile, I have my fourth paradigm. What name are we going to give it? The term you most commonly hear is creative entrepreneur. I hate every part of that phrase. I hate creative because it's a business buzzword as used in that phrase, and it effectively equates art with any other form of market-oriented creativity, like food or fashion or writing computer code. I hate entrepreneur because the self-employed artist is not an entrepreneur. They are not building a business that will expand and add workers and issue stock and increase in equity value and make you rich. They are merely self-employed, which is another way of saying unemployed. And I hate creative entrepreneur. I hate the whole phrase because it's become a term that's used to conceal the true conditions of independent artists and other creators. My term is producer, the artist as producer, and this is how I put it in the book. We live in an age of economic atomization, a time when more and more of us are not professionals durably attached to institutions, not workers durably attached to employers, and God knows, not entrepreneurs, but simply producers, free particles in the marketplace, finding what work we can for what money we can, and exposed without protection to the market's whims. Because that's the other thing that needs to be said, and the last thing that I'm going to say about the condition of the artist today. It's gotten a lot harder to make a living. Even respected full-time artists, so-called mid-tier artists, have trouble making ends meet. And that's also in part, I would say, largely because of the internet. Anything that can be digitized, like music, text, visual images, has had its price driven down to zero or near zero. Also, while the internet has enabled you to put your stuff out there, it's also enabled everybody else to put their stuff out there. For example, each year, over 1 million books are self-published each year. So more and more people are competing for a smaller and smaller pie. On top of that, we've experienced an explosion of costs for housing, for tuition, and for healthcare. So broadly speaking, revenues are down, costs are up. Being an artist has gone, again, a successful mid-tier artist has gone from a middle-class occupation to a working-class one. And we know what it means to be working class in the United States in the 20th century. It means that you're poor. Still, artists are finding a way to make it work. This is also something I document in great detail in the book. In fact, it's most of the book. And I'm happy to be joined today by 3 of those artists who are making it work. And now I'm going to turn it over to the first of them, SAMMUS. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the kind of breadth of the information that you were able to give in that introduction. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my journey or my path from making beats in my bedroom to winding up as a postdoctoral fellow at Brown. And I want to kind of undergird the conversation with ideas about luck and meritocracy, which I think are very much intertwined with how we think about art and how I often used to think about arts practice. Because I think when folks look back at my career, there can an intention can emerge that wasn't necessarily there when I was making the choices that I was making. And I really want to underscore that so much of this is about luck and, you know, for me, pop cultural references that I may refer to in my music being relevant at the time that I dropped this particular song. So it's really important, I think, for us to let go of these ideas about meritocracy within arts and who's successful and who's not. So to kind of give you a backstory about my work, I grew up loving video games. I fell in love with video games and video game music very young as a kid. I grew up in Ithaca, New York. There wasn't a whole bunch going on. So between being inside my head and watching cartoons and movies and playing video games, that was kind of it. And the thing that really spoke to me was video game music. I felt like it was otherworldly. I didn't understand it and I wanted to be a part of it. And so I basically bothered my older brother, who was a self-taught guitarist. He'd taken a few piano lessons to teach me how I could make music, and he did that. And so I made little songs on my little keyboard, and I would record video game music on my cassette player and play it back for my friends. And in high school, I started making beats using software on the computer, a program called Reason, and a video game called MTV Music Generator. And through those programs, I was able to finally produce the songs that I had been wanting to produce, these kind of video game inflected pieces of production. I showed them to my friends thought they were weird. And then before I knew it, I was going off to college. And right around that time was when I first heard Kanye West's College Dropout, which has a lot of kind of soul samples, highly pitched soul samples, which I thought was super cool. I'd never heard anything like it. And at that point, I pivoted to making hip hop focused beats. And when I went into undergrad to kind of speak to the points that were made earlier, it never occurred to me that I could focus on music. Even as I was making music in my dorm room, I thought, you know, there's no space or room for this as a career. In my mind, there was only Mariah Carey or busking on the sidewalk. There was no middle ground. And I didn't think with my little hip hop beats, I was gonna be anywhere near Mariah Carey. So it wasn't an option. Even as I lived in a music focused dorm in undergrad, I still kind of hid from folks that I was a musician. And so it wasn't until I graduated from undergrad, went on to teaching through Teach for America, that I started rapping for the first time, mostly as a way to express frustrations that I was feeling with my kind of life circumstances in the educational system, but also to kind of try to get my students to think about how cool it is to be a nerd. So I talked about being a nerd in my music and doing my homework and getting my GPA up. That was like the focus of a whole bunch of my early rap music. And I shared it with some of my friends and they really loved what I was doing. They thought it was interesting that I talked about video games and tried to weave it in with social theory and all these other concepts. So I started making more of it and more of it. And eventually I had a show for the first time and a few people came to that. And then I put together my first EP and dropped that on the website Bandcamp, which was very new at the time. And I was so excited when people bought a few copies of my EP. And from that alone, I thought, oh, okay, well, I can become a full-time artist for sure. This is easy. And so at the end of my term with Teach for America, I said, okay, I'm going to spend this summer becoming a full-time artist. I booked a few shows. And right at that time, my car got totally totaled. And I wound up having to take a job as a substitute teacher. I lost my health insurance. I was sick the whole summer. It was very awful. And I basically defeatedly went back to grad school. And so I decided when I was going back to grad school in Ithaca and Cornell University that I wasn't going to do music anymore, that it wasn't kind of serving the purpose that it had served initially. And it wasn't until I sort of talked to other folks that I realized, you know, maybe this is something I can do even while I'm in this cold upstate New York town and no one's going to come to my shows. And I started making connections, putting my music out. And I was really surprised by the audience that I found through Bandcamp. There were other people who had been making music about video games and hip hop for years prior to what I had been making. And I discovered that music through that connection. So from there, I kind of had these dual careers of working on music, touring when I could, putting out albums, and then working on my PhD at the same time. And when I tell people that, they think, wow, that's so incredible, you're so amazing. And what I like to underscore is that I was just scared. I didn't know which direction to move in. And I felt like, you know, there was a kind of a sunk cost mentality that, well, I've been in my PhD program for so long that I can't really let it go, but also I love music and it makes me whole. And I started to realize eventually that I could play both of those worlds off of each other to sort of advance or move through these different spaces. So I started saying, hey, I'm a rapper who's working on her PhD, and different kinds of folks would come and check out my music. Or in my scholarship, I would talk about the musical work that I was doing and started making connections between the two. And so through that, I've been able to stay within an academic space while kind of pursuing my creative interests. And that's kind of the thing that's enabled me to stay afloat. But it's been a very kind of touch and go situation. Even the postdoc that I'm in, prior to applying for it, I had decided I was going to be done with academia and I was going to kind of pursue a full-time career as an artist. And an advisor of mine said, you have to apply for this. You cannot, you have to apply for this. It's going to really affect your ability to produce your music if you have the support of an institution behind you. And so kind of on a whim, I applied to this postdoc, but I'm very grateful and fearful to think where I might have been if I hadn't moved forward with this postdoc at this particular moment. So I just want to underscore that so much of this is luck, and so much of this is just being around at the right time and producing artwork that folks feel captivated by and can support in particular ways. And I'd like to, I guess, close by talking about some of the things that have given me hope for the future of art, organizing spaces that I've been a part of that have really helped me to think more interdependently about music creation. One of those is the Union of Musicians and Allied Workers, which sort of formed in response to COVID-19 and the devastating effects that it was having on musicians and music workers who weren't finding a community through other more formal union spaces. And so all these DIY artists, these punks that I had met on tour, we kind of came together and started talking about what can we do? What is there to do? And so we drafted letters in response to the Senate and in regards to the CARES Act. And we started making connections for artists between what we were working with and dealing with and other freelancers, and trying to kind of build solidarity between these different kinds of movements. And so at this time, I think one of the major, the things that stands out the most to me about that organizing work was bringing together folks who had never seen themselves as being in relationship with each other to kind of be in conversation. So there are folks who are organizing against the post office being defunded, and musicians realizing how critical the post office is for any sort of creative endeavor, realize this is something we need to support. So there's a relationship now between different kinds of organizers and different movements than I think would have been possible a few years ago. So I'll leave it at that, and I would like to pass the mic to Atiya Jones.
Oh man, what a tough act to follow. Thank you so much. So yes, my name is Atiya Jones, and I am a multidisciplinary artist. I utilize line drawings, murals, photography, and fiber as my main mediums. Through my artwork, I'm able to convey and process my experiences as a Black woman, just as a Black human being, my witnesses of gentrification, and as an empathetic humanitarian in the world. But my artwork is also my source of capital. I would describe my wild lines as alluring and pervasive occupants of space. They are my reflection of gentrification and its ability to shapeshift and seemingly appear out of nowhere. They've become my direct language, and they are my territorial markings. They say I exist, and I have been here, and I will be here. I think in a time of immense erasure, this is of the utmost importance to me. And I am especially inspired by the work of street artists who have basically commandeered space for themselves, for their voices in a world that has allotted them none, and they've done so publicly. It's been 4 years since Bill interviewed me for this book, and reflecting upon my journey of moving to Pittsburgh, I could really tell you a million reasons for having left New York. But I think it was after completing a series of residencies and kind of realizing that I could leave New York, that I didn't have to be in this constant hamster wheel of making money to pay rent, and exiting the city really offered me clarity to dream bigger. The clarity, the time, the space to actually manifest dreams. And so I wanted to find people like myself, whatever that meant. And without the knowledge of what it would entail emotionally or financially, I just set out to be an artist. And my experience as an artist is deeply entangled into my experiences as a human being. I have had access to certain spaces financially, educationally, and socially. And these good schools allotted me what I call cultural fluidity. And it's immeasurable in a world where I'm often the only person of color or the only Black woman in a room. Because of these years spent in what I call close proximity to whiteness, there are rooms in which I know how to be a chameleon of the lexicon at hand. However, my ability to code switch and interact with a multitude of communities does not negate my desire to be with and around people who look like me. And so honestly, when I arrived in Pittsburgh, I started asking, like, where are all the Black people? And oddly enough, there were actual answers. I can't lie. I was birthed into Pittsburgh slightly jaded, and it surprised me that Black neighborhoods were so, in fact, tucked away and off to the side, and that people were like, oh, Black people are over here. They're in Homewood. They're, you know, people had mentioned low rent and grant foundations supporting artists, but no one really talked to me about the very low Black population rate. It's 13% of the city, or the fact that the city really, you can still feel the effects of redlining here and the limiting of livelihoods of Black people through racist practices within real estate, which then directly negatively correlate to a neighborhood's education system, as well as the ability for Black people to become business owners and their ability to enter the workforce confidently. And redlining as a practice didn't end until 1968. And I'm saying end because I don't really believe that these things are over. And so now we're looking at a time in which Black artists are not only working to create our work, but we're also really working to create equity, and equity for ourselves as individuals, but also equity for those alongside us and behind us. When I'm approached for a job, I want to know the ways in which my collaborators are working to make sure I'm not a tokenized figure in their venture. You know, what ways can we work together to get several people of color involved? What type of community does this project build? You know, my feelings of solitude in these spaces have been so emotionally exhaustive. And so when we ask about the future of art, we also have to look at a multitude of things. We have to consider the Black experience, which we haven't explored as a people, I think, enough. We haven't explored the concept of emotional safety enough as a general idea, let alone letting that dwindle down to how emotional safety affects a Black, female, queer, freelance artist. And so I believe in order to begin fathoming a future for art, we also have to deeply examine and acknowledge the barriers of financial and cultural inequity and social injustices which non-white people have to push through constantly just for the basic admission. The playing field has in fact never been even. Systemic gaslighting has to end. But that also requires victims of systemic gaslighting to be believed. Furthermore, I believe that our educational and cultural institutions must be held accountable for developing spaces that are actually inclusive and not just visually diverse. Cultural norms like gatekeeping need to be replaced with community leadership, and capitalism has to scale back and make room for humanism. Perhaps another good question is, how do we pivot towards a society in which non-white people feel safe enough and have the necessary access to pursue their dreams? And with that question, I will pass the mic to Monica Byrne.
Hello, Atiya. Thank you so much for passing it off. And now I have to follow in all of your footsteps. And I have literally rewritten all of my notes as you were talking. So you know, this is going to be sort of seed of ants. But there's so much in what all of you said that I wanted to respond to and reinforce. Just very briefly, I am a science fiction writer, a playwright, a performer, but mostly, you know, a writer. And I grew up, you know, drawing and writing and making stories and forcing people into my theater clubs in 3rd grade. And that gave me a lot of joy. And then it all gave me a lot of joy and came very easily to me. And then when I was 14, I decided I wanted to be an astronaut instead. I did not want to be an artist. I wanted to be an astronaut. And there are a few reasons for that. One of the reasons was I grew up in a very conservative part of the country in central Pennsylvania, and I was bullied a lot. And so that identifying with a very extremely ambitious future was a sort of way out. It was a way for me to identify with a way out of that situation in that place. And it wasn't a whim. It actually took me for the next 10 years. I got 2 degrees in biochemistry. I got a pilot's license. I worked for NASA during the summers, all in pursuit of this goal to become an astronaut. And then in graduate school, to deal with the stress of being in graduate school, I started taking an improv class, and I started writing for the school newspaper. And both of those things gave me so much more joy than what I was doing in the lab, that there came a point where I just said, I hate this. I hate this. And I would just love to do what makes me happy. And I was very lucky to have, I'm the youngest of 5 children, and all of my older siblings are some combination of artist and teacher. And I was talking to one of my sisters who was then like leading her own rock group in Atlanta, and asked her, you know, isn't it horrible being an artist? It must be such a struggle. It just, like, it sounds terrible. And I remember there was a long pause on the other end. And then she just said, it's actually wonderful. It's actually really wonderful. And of course there's struggle, but I'm really happy. I'm really happy, you know, sort of saying no to all the things I'm supposed to be doing, and learning to sing and play the guitar in Atlanta. And so that gave me permission to just be like, oh, I can do this. And so I left Boston and I moved to Durham, North Carolina, similar maybe to Atiya, because it was a place that had a low cost of living where I could make a future. And my other 2 options were Atlanta and New York. And those were just, I've seen so many people burn out young in big cities, and I still am, and it makes me sad. And I feel very fortunate that I chose Durham. And so for the next 8 years, I chose day jobs that would pay me enough to live on, that would not sap my emotional or creative energy. So, you know, no public radio producing, no teaching. I was a lab technician for many, many years. And then finally in 2013, I sold my first novel and sold it for a large advance. And that was a very good and fortunate thing. It hasn't been all smooth sailing since then. And I don't want to give that impression, but I'm stopping my sort of career narrative there, because that is the point after which I was like, okay, I can make a living at this and I can be successful. But success has a very specific definition for me. Success means, do I have enough money to make the next thing? And if I have enough money to make the next thing, then I am a successful artist. And that is maybe by some definitions very sad. For me, it's just like, this is the reality I've learned to inhabit, is that like, I am not gonna ever own a house. I am not gonna have children. I also don't want children, so it's actually convenient. But like, if I wanted to, I couldn't, because I love my work and I am wedded to my work. And so this narrowing bottleneck of economic times for artists that Bill described, I am slipping through it well for a whole set of circumstances that have nothing to do with talent or hard work. And that actually leads me to my next point, which is that SAMMUS or Anongo said previously, so much of success, however you define it, comes down to luck. And I would call it privilege. I mean, so there is luck, there is connections, there is hard work, there is talent. I would put privilege above all of those. And we see, as Atiya and Anongo alluded to earlier, just in every single industry, people of color, people who aren't, you know, white and cis and men, deal with obstacles at every single level. And careers are just like are just a series of obstacles. It's just an obstacle course. And what I'm finding, I can speak to theater and publishing because they're the industries I know best. There are many reforms that could easily be instituted. And by easily, I just mean it needs the will. They need the will. And the will is lacking. If you say, okay, we need this editorial department to be at least half editors of color, you'll find a way to do that. Or you don't have the will to do it and you won't do it. You will find a way to pay interns. You will find a way to flatten advances so everyone gets, you know, one kind of advance, and it's not like, you know, 90 people getting $1,000 advance and then one person getting a $500,000 advance, which is how it works now. But the will is still lacking, and that's largely because the people who are in those decision-making posts are white and privileged in many different ways. So to close, I don't know how long I've spoken. To close, I want to say, as far as the future of art, I'm a science fiction writer, so it is my job to imagine the future. But I think the job of imagining the future is actually not exclusive to being a science fiction writer. I see artists as futurists, period. There are Walida Imarisha and Adrienne Marie Brown are two artist activists who make a really good point that science fiction, and in fact all art, is imagining the future into existence. And that is what I see all of my fellow artists doing. I mean, Bill said, you know, artists haven't always been tellers. And now I think not only are they, but they have to be. We have to be. The world is going to change in the next 30 years, in the next 60 years, in the next 100 years, because of climate change and other reasons, into something unrecognizable from what it is today. Like that is a fact. And I wish that more people would trust artists to lead the way instead of infantilizing us in economic and other ways and saying like, oh, you know, the masses, like, oh, all of your stuff is, you make a lot of bad stuff, and you know, you don't make good economic decisions. Artists actually make great economic decisions because we have to. We're really good with money because it's a necessity. Because as Bill said, you know, we're working class, like successful artists are generally working class. And I just want to say I appreciated Bill reaching out to me and reaching out to all of us. I read the book in 5 days because for the first time, someone was listening to us and someone was not telling us that our bitterness about the way things were was just a matter of sour grapes or a matter of delusion or a matter of whining, that there was actually a very real problem that was contributing to the possible end of art as we know it. So I see artists as futurists. That is the future. It's not the death of art at all. But in order to trust artists to be our futurists and our leaders, you have to pay them directly. Okay, and now with that, I am going to give it back to you, Rebecca, to introduce the Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Monica. Thank you all. And I had the same sense when I read the book. I had this feeling like things were finally being spoken that, you know, we don't talk about in art. So questions are coming in, and the first one is to Bill. So Bill, do you see any connection to the rise in numbers of women in the arts and the reduction in the value of arts, as has been the case for many fields associated with women's work?
No, that's not something I've ever thought about. I think it's a good question, but I don't really think it's the case because, first of all, I mean, I think in certain fields of art, the women have been pretty well represented for a long time. They may not have been valued as much as they should have been, certainly in novel writing, but also because in most cases, we're not talking about like the wage gap, like, you know, women are paid less than men for the same jobs, because we're not talking about people with jobs. So, you know, when Napster and then piracy and Spotify and everything else demonetized, you know, recorded music, the algorithms don't know who's making the music. And I don't think any of that was, I mean, I don't think there was any kind of sexist intent behind any of it. It was just like some guy figured out how he can, you know, rip MP3 files and make music free, right? Or the rise in housing costs, or the rise in tuition. I mean, maybe I'm being naive as a man, and I would love to hear what the women think about this. But I feel like these are market forces. Obviously, everything is amplified by the fact that women are in a disadvantaged economic position and people of color are. Of course, you have to multiply everything by that factor. But I'm not sure that the forces themselves are driven by that.
I'd like to jump in quickly with just an anecdote from a friend of mine who, she was her own manager, and she found that when she responded to emails with this name where people couldn't tell what the gender of the person was, she had very different responses and was able to negotiate differently than she was when she kind of replied from her email address, which had this sort of feminine sounding name. So there are these ways in which even our ability to negotiate on a day-to-day level is, when it seems like there isn't bias sort of built in, it can reflect in these sort of really kind of minor or everyday granular ways where people are receiving you differently based on who they think you are, who they think your manager is, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, there was a great article last year about a colleagues in a real estate office, a man and a woman who switched genders for the week, or who switched names for the week. They would reply to each other's emails for a week. So he got to experience exactly what you're talking about, Inongo. He said it was the worst week of his work life. He never experienced, people were so resistant to what he was saying, and she had the best week. Yeah, very interesting. Atiya and Monica, any like thoughts for you about gender in terms of how it affects your work?
Oh my God. A lot. I will just say that algorithms are definitely not neutral. Yeah, That's scientifically demonstrable. And just Google algorithm bias. But it's not only, you know, in the day-to-day, it's the granular one-on-one interactions that Anango talked about. And it is also that algorithms are definitely biased because algorithms are designed by people, and those people are usually white men. So I'll just say that.
I mean, can you hear me? I also find it interesting just from the fact that that question was posed to Bill when there are 3 femme people on the panel. That in and of itself demonstrates how often women are ignored when we're in a room. I feel like that right there says so much about the experience. That's really all I have to add. I don't know. Yeah, like, why did we ask Bill?
So there's another question about the role of the artist in gentrification, thinking in terms of both Atiya and Bill's remarks. As the artist is more and more part of the marketplace, how has the social role shifted from the bohemian to the agent of displacement?
Something that I spoke with Bill about when we were originally doing this interview for the book had to do with artists' roles within the world of gentrification. Often we are seen as the first people to enter a neighborhood, if you will, an at-risk neighborhood or unsavory, whatever words we're using for Black neighborhoods now. We can be the first people on the scene. And I think that it's important to navigate a little bit under the radar until you have invested in your neighborhood. I think that one of the largest betraying aspects of gentrification is the lack of community reinvestment. So if you are able to live in a neighborhood for a low rental rate, what are you then doing with those saved funds? Are you shopping locally? Are you finding out, you know, where the Black businesses are, where any marginalized businesses are? Like, what are you doing with the advantage you have gained as a newcomer to a space? In regards to the offenders on the echelon of gentrification, I'm not so sure that fine artists are in that realm so much, unless they're very successful, financially successful. But maybe like our young graphic designers and maybe those types, the young San Francisco types, perhaps. But I'm not sure that the artist is really the person in gentrification that we have to worry about as much as other populations.
There's a really wonderful interview from an artist named Transgender VHS, and in it they talk about the distinction between communities and scenes, and really being attuned to what kind of space you're trying to create, and that a community is often intergenerational. There's dialogue between different folks within the space, and I think, like Atiya is saying, an awareness of what the needs of the space are versus a scene, right? Which is very much about being seen, which is very much about presenting the work and the forward-facing project of what a scene space is. So I think even having that terminology or thinking towards that is a really important part of thinking about where you fall in the ecosystem of your particular space that you're living in.
Monica, you had described your work really beautifully in terms of success of having enough money to make the next work. And so someone in the audience is really curious how, Atiya and Anango, how you define success for your work.
I guess I'll go first. My definitions of success have really changed over the years. And I think that they were closer to Monica's in the beginning, where it's like, okay, do I have the funds to get to the next step or the next phase, wherever it might be in life? And now that is looking a little bit more like, am I a successful human being? Am I a good person? Am I reliable? Can I be what I want to see in the world, essentially? And so success has really pulled back from just financial to really a more humane approach to living for me.
That's beautiful, powerful. And I feel very much the same. I think as someone who's struggled with a variety of mental health issues, for me, it's very much been about being okay and feeling like I have the resources to be able to do that. And I think another part of it for me is if I'm in a space where I can kind of route resources to people who are not able to access those same resources. So now that I'm at Brown in this postdoctoral fellowship, it's like, okay, well, where's the money? How do I get it to my rapper friends who are brilliant, but might never be able to come into a space like this without a cosign? And I think that's become a part of figuring out, you know, am I successful or not? Have I successfully brought others with me into this space? Because otherwise, what's the point even? So yeah, thank you, Atiya, for your comments.
So this question, we'll start with Bill and then open it up if anyone wants to jump in. Bill, what role can institutions play in ensuring that artists do not have to be hustlers, both public and private? European Union seems to have more support for creative workers. How much of the questions we are discussing can be addressed through robust public support and funding?
Well, that's a big question that touched on a lot of issues. It's certainly true that public support for the arts is much higher, and it's actually 63 times higher in Europe. I was shocked when I discovered that number as a percentage of GDP. Institutions can pay artists fairly. I mean, first of all, a lot of institutions, nonprofit institutions like arts presenting spaces, will ask artists to do work for free. They've got to stop doing that. They've got to start recognizing that artwork is work. The work of art is work, and not just pay them, but pay them fairly and pay them equitably. So there's a movement in the world of visual arts. There's a group called WAGE, Working Artists in the Greater Economy, and they've been specifically attacking this problem. Universities need to stop hiring people as adjuncts for poverty wages. Somebody quoted to me, she couldn't verify the figure, but 93% of people who teach visual arts in universities are adjuncts or part-timers, 93%. A lot of the problems in the arts economy are problems that are problems in the larger economy. So the solutions have to be in the larger economy, raising the minimum wage, allowing unions to do what they should be doing, basically extending protections to gig workers, taking on the tech monopolies, breaking up the tech monopolies, or regulating them as public utilities. So there's no one answer, and I certainly don't think that public funding is the answer. I think that's a mistake that we make. It's never going to solve the problem, and I think it has its own problems. But yeah, all of those things, all of those things.
Anyone else want to jump in?
Well, just in thinking about the concept of the creative entrepreneur, although Bill hates that phrasing, I actually identify with it deeply because I am both creative and developing a business. My art practice is 100% a business. I have to think about growth and moving into production and strategy and all of those things. With that said, the fact that we are moving in a direction in which artists are also their artist managers and their business developers, I think artists need to learn how to negotiate for themselves. As much as we should develop expectations from our institutions, we also need to learn how to have those conversations with institutions and to make those requests for ourselves. And that information was not offered to me at the jump. That information really came in through working with other artists who were primarily white. We're like, oh, no, you need to get paid for that. And you also need to identify what is work for you. Because if someone wants you to do a thing on Instagram, if that is work for you, then you should be paid for that. So kind of piggybacking off of what Bill is saying, I think you need to know how to navigate these situations from the end of the artist as well.
Atiya, while you have the mic, we're gonna have a question just for you. Could you comment on the need for art to promote and communicate equity, either gender, race, or class? How do you feel art can bring attention to the inequities that exist in communities that we inhabit? How do we best use art to reach the audiences that are reaffirming and perpetuating these unjust systems?
Art is being utilized for those, for all of those causes at this very moment. All advertising is art. Any bus poster for COVID information is about equity and sustainability and survival for human beings. Art is already doing those things. Artists within rooms on the back end, not just producing visual art, but writers and journalists and musicians continuing to convey our lived experience is everything right now. I recently came back from West Virginia, and it was a beautiful experience while we were camping, but the 4 hours of travel to and fro felt incredibly horrifying and dangerous. And a lot of that was visual communication. And it's a very simple flag in front of somebody's house. You know, that is the role of art. Art is everywhere all the time. Everything is designed by someone. And so we're looking at it. Art is on both sides of this fence.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to, figure out the question. So maybe we just have time for one more question for everybody. So in your work, what alternative values are there aside from monetary value?
Oh, I feel like I've been talking. Someone else should.
Inango?
Let me think on that for 10 seconds. What other values are there aside from monetary value? So I feel like for me, the primary value is sort of like a creative impulse is being engaged. Like that's, for me, in making the art, that's where a lot of that's where the value comes from for me. And I don't want to pretend that monetary value has nothing to do with it, but that comes, I think, after I'm out of the space of creation, or maybe that's being disingenuous too. But I think in the moment when the seed is first there, it's about scratching an itch or answering a question or trying to figure something out about the world. I think another value that's important for me once the thing gets out into the universe is like relationships is kind of another value that I'm bringing into the space. Like what kind of relationships can I build from this piece of art or from this thing that I've made, and who can I support through this? So there's definitely, I think as artists, we're navigating all these different value systems all the time, and monetary, unfortunately, in this capitalist society is bearing down on us at all times. But I think most of us would say that we approach it, it's one piece of a much bigger pie around how you value the work that you're doing.
I would say, similar to what Inango was saying, the pleasure comes first. The joy of creating comes first, and I never get sick of it. Like I'm just so addicted to writing something new, to perfecting something I've been working on for a long time. and to telling the truth. And, you know, the truth is such a vague philosophical concept, but it's also like the lived reality of, if you're really in the groove and you're, you know, writing something or creating something that is true for you, you don't want to do anything else. And the money follows that. The reason I have a community on Patreon of people supporting me is because I do that, is because I follow my own pleasure first. And it's not, you know, 100% hedonism all the time. I mean, I think a lot of people would say that my work has a lot of, you know, social value in many dimensions, but it's first the impulse of joy. And everything follows in the wake of that. And that's been my lived sort of economic truth as much as anything. Yeah.
I would also have to agree with both of you that the production, the creative process and making a thing. I love putting lines together to make an image. I love knitting and creating a wearable item. And I've been making PPE and you know, face coverings, face masks, and providing myself with mental stability and a mental outlet during these really wild times, but also being able to then have an offering for another human being and provide them with joy and safety. And perhaps they're all airs right now. Perhaps these are all placebo effects. But right now, being able to make beautiful things and share them with other people and then see that joy reflected back at me is a cycle that I want to be in.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you, Inongo, Atiya, and Monica for generously sharing behind the scenes conditions of your work as artists and your visions for challenging structures and empowering artists. Thank you, Bill, for advocating for the value of art, for this wake-up call to problems in the arts economy, and for making it clear that these issues are rooted in extreme inequality. The recording of this event will be available at the Arts Initiative website. If you'd like to continue this conversation, Literati Bookstore is hosting a further conversation with Bill on Sunday, September 27th at 7 p.m. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.